The air hung heavy with smoke, a relentless pall that dulled the sun's feeble attempt to pierce the grey veil above Alexandria. Among the crumbled stones and smouldering embers of the great library, I knelt on the cold earth, fingers trembling as I sifted carefully through the scattered remains. Charred fragments of parchment lay scattered like fallen leaves, their edges brittle, their inscriptions faint yet stubbornly enduring beneath the ash. Each piece was a shard of a world once whole: wisdom, poetry, philosophy, and the accumulated knowledge of countless generations, now reduced to fragile whispers of ink and fire. My breath came in ragged gasps, the acrid smoke clawing at my throat, yet I dared not stop. Every fragment might be all that remained, a fragile ember of light amid the overwhelming darkness. I traced the furrowed lines of a burned verse, the words faint but legible enough to stir a flicker of defiance within me. Here, in these fragments, lay the promise that knowledge could outlast even the fiercest blaze. The fire had claimed the walls and scrolls, but it had not yet claimed the words themselves. Callimachus appeared beside me, leaning heavily on his staff. His white beard was streaked with soot, his spectacles askew, but the sharpness in his eyes burned still. He regarded the scattered fragments with a grave solemnity, then allowed a faint nod. "These pieces," he murmured, "are all that remain, yet they are a beginning, small fragments of light in a vast darkness. We must carry them forward." His words, though quiet, struck a chord deep within me. The weight of loss was immense, yet the responsibility to preserve what little survived was heavier still. We gathered the fragments with utmost care, wrapping them in cloth to shield them from the lingering heat and the ever-present threat of rain or further ruin. Nearby, Selene stood sentinel at the ruined library's entrance, her silhouette sharp against the darkening sky. Her eyes scanned the horizon with fierce resolve, the firelight reflecting in their depths like twin stars refusing to be extinguished. Her presence was a shield not only for our fragile cargo, but for the fragile hope that still flickered within us. Inside the shattered halls, Nerissa sat cross-legged on a stone bench, her youthful face illuminated by the flickering glow of a small oil lamp. Ink-stained fingers moved deftly across clean parchment, copying the salvaged verses with a reverence that belied her years. I watched her for a moment, a symbol of renewal amid destruction, an apprentice carrying the torch of knowledge forward into the uncertain night. As dusk settled, a familiar figure approached through the haze: the merchant, his weathered hands clutching a small bundle wrapped tightly in cloth. He offered it to me without a word, a simple gesture laden with unspoken understanding. Inside, I found fresh parchment and ink, untouched by fire and ruin. The gift was a lifeline, a reaffirmation that even in the darkest hours, human solidarity could kindle renewal. I unwrapped the bundle with care, the smooth sheets promising new beginnings. The ink, rich and black, awaited the stroke of my pen. I felt a swell of gratitude and determination rise within me. The fire had taken much, but it had not yet taken the spirit that fueled these words, the intellectual fire that burns eternal even as the physical world crumbles. Together we set to work. Nerissa's pen danced across the fresh parchment, transcribing the fragments I recited from memory. Callimachus offered guidance, recalling passages lost to the flames but preserved within the minds of survivors. Selene's watchful gaze ensured our fragile endeavor was not interrupted by chaos or threat. And I, the poet, wove these scattered threads into verses that sought to capture the essence of what had been and what might yet endure. The night deepened. Within the small circle of light and ink, a fragile hope blossomed. Each word written was an act of defiance, a beacon against oblivion. These fragments of knowledge, though broken and scorched, were more than relics. They were the seeds from which future understanding might grow. Yet even as we worked, the weight of loss pressed upon us. The silence of the once vibrant halls was a haunting echo, a reminder of the impermanence of human endeavors. The flames had been merciless, but in their wake, a new fire kindled, a fire of memory, storytelling, and the unyielding belief that words outlive stone and ash. I paused often, listening to the crackle of dying embers and the faint rustle of parchment, the sounds a solemn symphony of endings and beginnings. The verses I composed were both elegy and promise, mourning what was lost yet embracing what might endure. As dawn approached, the first pale light filtered through the smoky skies, casting long shadows over the ruined library. We gathered the newly copied scrolls, their edges clean and unblemished, and wrapped them carefully for the journey ahead. The path was uncertain, fraught with peril and sorrow, but these fragments of light would accompany us, a testament to resilience and the eternal flame of human thought. And so, as the city stirred beneath the burden of loss, I understood that though the great library had fallen, its spirit lived on within us. In every word preserved, every story told, the intellectual fire endured an unquenchable blaze that no destruction could ever fully silence. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, but with these fragments of light, we carried a fragile hope that the essence of human knowledge and memory could be reborn from ashes, whispered on the winds of time, and inscribed forever in the hearts of those who dared to remember. The flames may have consumed the walls, but they could not consume the words, and as long as words remain, so too does the promise of dawn. The once vibrant halls of the great library now lay draped in a shroud of silence that felt almost sacred in its weight. My footsteps echoed softly against the blackened stone, a hollow sound that marked the absence of the relentless curiosity and vibrant discourse that had filled this place only days before. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke, lingering like a bitter memory that refused to dissipate. Where once the voices of scholars rose in spirited debate, now only the crackling of dying embers dared to speak. I paused in the center of what had been the heart of the library, the grand reading room where light had danced upon countless scrolls and manuscripts. The shelves were but skeletal remains, charred and collapsing, their precious contents turned to ash. My hands trembled as I touched the scorched wood, a futile gesture, perhaps, but one born of desperation to grasp something tangible, something real, of what had been lost. The weight of silence pressed upon me, a void carved by fire that seemed to swallow not only knowledge, but the very spirit of Alexandria. Yet, amid this devastation, I found a strange clarity. The silencing of the library's voices was not an end, but a transformation. Though the physical forms of wisdom had been consumed, their essence, the ideas, the questions, the relentless pursuit of truth lingered still in the spaces between the ruins. I bent to retrieve a fragment of parchment, its edges curled and blackened but still bearing the delicate script of a scholar long silenced. Fingers stained with ash, I read aloud, my voice cracking yet resolute, the words rising like a fragile flame against the overwhelming dark. "In knowledge lies the soul of our city," I recited, the phrase trembling through the quiet air. "Though walls may fall and scrolls may burn, the thought endures an eternal ember in the night." The sound of my voice seemed to breathe life back into the hollow chamber, a whispered defiance against oblivion. I was no longer merely a witness to destruction. I was its chronicler, its bearer of memory. Each line I spoke, each verse I composed was a beacon cast into the void, a promise that the spirit of this place would not perish with the flames. Outside, the night was heavy with smoke and ash, embers drifting like lost stars across the darkened sky. Celine stood vigilant at the library's ruined entrance, her silhouette sharp against the flickering glow. Her eyes, fierce and unwavering, scanned the horizon, guarding not just the remnants of stone and parchment, but the fragile hope that something enduring might yet rise from the ashes. I joined her briefly, the cold air biting through my tattered robes as we shared a moment of silent understanding. In her steadfast gaze, I saw mirrored the resolve that had taken root within me. This was no longer a battle merely for books and scrolls. It was a struggle for memory itself, for the soul of a civilization that refused to be extinguished. Returning to the small fire we had kindled beyond the ruins, I unfurled a fresh scroll and dipped my quill into ink. The flickering light cast long shadows over the charcoal-streaked page as my hand moved with renewed purpose. Each verse was a testament to loss and resilience, a weaving of sorrow and hope that sought to capture the ineffable, the knowledge that even in silence, stories endure. The night deepened, but my resolve did not waver. Around me, the city of Alexandria slept uneasily, unaware of the quiet revolution taking place in the heart of its ruin. I wrote not for the present, but for the future, for those who would come seeking the truth long after the flames had cooled and the stones had crumbled. In the echo of silence, I heard the faintest stirrings of a new dawn. The library's voice may have been stilled, but its story was far from over. Words would carry its flame, undying and unyielding, through the darkness and into the light ahead. And so, with trembling hands but an unbreakable spirit, I committed my verses to the fragile scrolls, weaving the echoes of this lost world into a tapestry that no fire could consume. For in every end lies a beginning, and in every silent hall, the promise of a voice yet to be heard. As the embers faded into the cold night, I whispered a final vow to be the keeper of memory, the guardian of stories, and the poet of the burning library. Though the voices have fallen silent, the song of knowledge will endure. The journey was far from over, and the night held many secrets yet to reveal. But as I gazed upward, the stars above Alexandria shimmered with quiet brilliance, a cosmic witness to the eternal flame of human thought. And in that light I found my hope. The story would continue, beyond ashes and silence, carried by the steadfast heart of those who dare to remember. The crackling blaze had reduced walls to rubble and scrolls to dust, but it could not quench the fire within my soul. Each word written, each verse spoken, was a beacon of defiance and affirmation that knowledge, though vulnerable, was not vanquished. The library's silence was profound, yet it echoed with the weight of centuries of wisdom, now entrusted to memory and verse. It was a silence filled with absence, yes, but also with the promise of return. For as long as stories were told, as long as voices rose in remembrance, the library would live on not as stone and parchment, but as the eternal flame of human intellect and spirit. And in that quiet I found a new beginning. The air was thick with smoke, acrid and choking, yet my hand would not cease its trembling dance across the delicate scroll. Around me, the great library, once a sanctuary of wisdom, had become a crucible of flame and ash. The roar of fire clawed at the vaulted ceilings, a furious beast devouring centuries of human thought. Yet within this inferno, I found a strange clarity. I was no longer merely a witness, but a scribe of memory, a keeper of the last breath of Alexandria's intellect. I crouched low near the shattered remains of a great oak shelf, its charred bones still glowing faintly beneath the ashen dust. The parchment before me was fragile, crinkling under my fingers like dry leaves in the wind, but it was my lifeline. Each word I penned was a defiant ember against the consuming darkness. When all is lost, the word remains, I murmured, tasting the truth of those words even as the smoke stung my eyes. Celine's voice cut through the chaos, a steady beacon. "Stay close, poet," she urged, her tone both commanding and protective. I looked up to see her silhouette etched against the flickering firelight, her stance unwavering. Her presence was a shield in this madness, a reminder that even as the city burned, some still fought to preserve what remained. Callimachus appeared beside me, leaning heavily on his staff, his white beard streaked with soot. His eyes, sharp despite age and wear, met mine with a grave solemnity. "There is a hidden alcove," he whispered, voice trembling yet resolute. "A place untouched, where some scrolls yet survive. We must reach it before the flames close the path." Together, we moved through the labyrinthine corridors, the heat intensifying, the fire's roar swelling to a deafening crescendo. The walls seemed to breathe smoke and despair, but within me, a stubborn flame of hope kindled. I clutched my precious scrolls tighter, the weight of centuries of knowledge pressed into fragile sheets of parchment. In the alcove Nerissa awaited, her young face illuminated by the firelight's dance. She bent over her work, copying my verses with painstaking care. Her fingers trembled, but her resolve was fierce. "These words will live," she said softly, eyes glistening with tears and determination. "I will carry them forward, even if all else is lost." A sudden crash echoed behind us, the library's heart succumbing to the blaze. Yet in that moment, surrounded by ruin and ruin's smell, I felt the power of the word. It was not flesh and wood that made a legacy endure, but memory, spirit, the unyielding human will to remember and to bear witness. I wrote then with all the strength left in me, weaving verses that spoke of loss and defiance, of fire's fury and the quiet resilience of thought. Each line was a promise, fragile as the parchment but bold as the city's dream, that knowledge, though battered and scarred, could outlast the fiercest flame. Outside, Celine called urgently, "Time is short!" I gathered the scrolls, heavy with the weight of hope and history. The flames licked nearer, but I stepped forward, carried by the courage of those who stood beside me. The great library, in all its glory, was dying, but its soul, the immortal fire of intellect, would live on through these last verses. As we fled into the smoky night, the roar of destruction behind us, I knew this was not an end, but a beginning. The words I carried were a torch passed in darkness, a fragile beacon for the dawn yet to come. And so I write even now, knowing that though the library falls, the human spirit, eternal and unyielding, survives in the breath of every story told. Every verse committed to memory, every whisper of hope against the silence of oblivion. This is my testament. This is the last verse of Alexandria's burning library. The air was thick with choking smoke, a bitter taste of ash filling my lungs as I stumbled through the labyrinthine corridors of the great library. The once majestic halls, lined with shelves that had held the wisdom of ages, were now collapsing around me in a cacophony of cracking timbers and falling plaster. My hands trembled as they clutched the precious bundle of scrolls, fragile vessels of memory, the few verses I had managed to weave in secrecy. Every breath was a struggle, every step burdened by the weight of despair and hope intertwined. Beside me, Celine moved with the grace and urgency of a warrior born. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the shadows for threats both natural and human. "Stay close," she urged, her voice firm but not without warmth. "The flames are not the only danger tonight." I nodded, swallowing the lump of fear lodged in my throat. The city around us was unraveling, its hubris consumed not only by fire but by chaos and desperation. We darted past a fallen beam, Celine steadying me as the world around us trembled. I could hear the distant roar of the blaze, swallowing the heart of Alexandria. The crackle of flames mingling with cries of panic and the shouts of men driven mad by loss. "This way," Celine commanded, pulling me toward a narrow passage known only to a few. She had promised to guide me safely beyond the inferno, and I clung to that promise like a lifeline. As we neared the outer gates, the night air grew cooler, but the danger sharpened. A group of looters had gathered, their faces twisted by greed and fear. They barred our path, crude weapons gleaming in the flickering light. Celine stepped forward, her stance unwavering. "You will not harm this man or what he carries," she declared, her voice ringing with authority forged in years of duty. The looters hesitated, caught between their desperation and the fierce determination in Celine's eyes. A tense silence fell, broken only by the distant crackle of the dying library. Slowly, they parted, allowing us passage. Beyond the gates, shadows embraced us. The merchant waited as promised, his rugged features barely visible under the dim canopy of stars. We exchanged hurried whispers, the urgency of our task pressing down like the smoke still choking the air. One by one, the scrolls were transferred to trusted couriers, their hands steady despite the peril. I stood for a moment, breathing deeply, the cold night air a stark contrast to the inferno left behind. The weight of loss pressed heavy upon my chest, yet within the fragile parchment lay a fragile promise, a defiance against oblivion. Though the great library had fallen, its essence might yet endure, carried in words immortal and unyielding. Celine's gaze met mine, fierce and resolute. "We live to remember," she said simply. I nodded, the ember of hope kindling within the ashes of despair. The journey ahead was uncertain, but the flame of knowledge, once thought lost, now flickered faintly in the dark, and as the city smoldered behind us, I knew that our flight was not just an escape, it was the first step in the long resistance of memory against the silence of oblivion. The night was far from over, but for the first time in days, I dared to believe that words might yet outlast the fire. The corridors had become a labyrinth of shadows and smoke, each step a gamble against falling debris and encroaching flame. My heart pounded in my chest, a relentless drum that matched the crackling roar around us. Celine's hand was firm on my shoulder, guiding me with a certainty I lacked. "This way," she whispered urgently, pulling me through a narrow archway hidden behind a toppled shelf. The air here was thick, almost suffocating, but the passage led toward the outer walls, a path to salvation. We paused briefly in a small alcove, and I unwrapped the bundle of scrolls I had so painstakingly compiled. The fragile parchment, inscribed with verses born of desperation and love for knowledge, seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Each line was a thread spun from the tapestry of the library's soul, a testament to what once was and what might still be. "You must promise me," I said, looking into Celine's eyes, "that these words will live on, even if the walls fall." Her gaze softened, the fierce warrior melting into a guardian of memory. "I swear it." Outside, the sounds of chaos grew louder. The crack of collapsing beams, the shouts of fleeing citizens, and the ever-present hiss of flames devouring centuries of wisdom. Yet within that small alcove, time seemed to pause, a fleeting sanctuary amid the ruin. "We cannot linger," Celine urged. "The merchant waits." We emerged into the night, the sky painted in hues of orange and red, the library's silhouette a jagged wound against the horizon. The scent of burning papyrus filled the air, a bitter perfume of loss. At the shadowed entrance of a narrow alley, the merchant awaited, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You have what we need?" he asked urgently. I nodded, handing over the scrolls with trembling hands. "These are the last verses. Guard them well." He took them without a word, slipping them into a hidden satchel. "They'll leave the city tonight." Relief crashed through me, mingling with the sorrow that clung to my bones. I turned to Celine, gratitude and exhaustion etched deep in my features. "Thank you for everything," she smiled briefly, the shadows softening the hardness in her eyes. "The fight is not over, but tonight we have won a small victory." Together, we retreated from the burning city, the echoes of the great library's final moments etched forever in my memory. The scrolls in safe hands were more than ink and parchment, they were the fragile flame of human thought, a beacon to guide the future through the darkness. As the night deepened, I wondered what dawn might bring. But for now, the words survived, and with them, a promise that even in ashes, knowledge could endure. The acrid sting of smoke still lingered in the air as I stepped away from the ruinous heart of what once was the great library of Alexandria. The charred remains stretched before me like a wound upon the city's soul-blackened pillars, twisted iron, and heaps of smoldering parchment that whispered tales now silenced. The sky above was a heavy gray smeared with streaks of ash that floated like fragile ghosts. My breath came uneven, a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief, but amidst the ruin, a stubborn ember of resolve kindled within me. Celine's presence beside me was a steadying force. Her eyes, fierce and unwavering, scanned the devastated landscape with the same sharpness that had helped me navigate the chaos within those burning halls. She was more than a guardian of flesh and blood. She was a sentinel for the fragile future we both dared to hope for. In her hands, she carried a bundle of scrolls wrapped carefully in oilcloth, each one a fragile vessel of memory and defiance. The weight of those scrolls was nothing compared to the burden they symbolized. "They will not be forgotten," I said softly, reaching out to take the precious cargo. Our fingers brushed, a silent pact forged amid the ruin. These words, they are all we have left. Her nod was firm, but her gaze betrayed the sorrow etched deep within. And we will carry them through whatever comes. I found a quiet alcove nestled in the city's outskirts, away from the murmur of mourning crowds and the stifling heat of destruction. There, beneath the waning light of a wary sun, I unrolled one of the salvaged scrolls. The parchment was brittle, edges singed, but the words inscribed upon it glowed with a quiet defiance. I read aloud, my voice trembling yet resolute, weaving the verses that had become my sanctuary and my weapon against oblivion. Around me, the city's heart beat faintly, the soft rustling of fabric, the whispered prayers, the tentative sighs of those who remained. My words were a balm and a beacon, a fragile thread pulling us from despair toward hope. I spoke of loss, of fire and ash, but also of the indomitable spirit that clings to memory when all else is lost. Night descended, cloaking Alexandria in a velvet shroud scattered with stars. I lifted my gaze to the heavens, the same stars that had watched over the library in its glory and its fall. The weight of human hubris pressed upon my chest, the arrogance that believed knowledge was eternal, the neglect that allowed flames to consume our heritage. Yet within me burned a small flame, fragile but unyielding, the immortal nature of words. In that moment, beneath the vast, indifferent sky, I understood the true burden of memory. It was not merely to remember, but to carry forward, to breathe life into the ashes through stories, through verses, through the unbroken thread of human thought. The library's walls might crumble, its scrolls might turn to dust, but the essence of what it held could survive, carried in the hearts and minds of those who dared to remember. As dawn threatened the horizon, I folded the scroll close, a promise sealed in ink and hope. The path ahead was shadowed and uncertain, but I was no longer merely a witness to history's end. I was its keeper, its voice in the silence, its fragile flame against the coming dark. And so, with the burden of memory heavy upon my shoulders, I stepped forward into the uncertain dawn of a world reborn from its own ashes. The night pressed heavy with silence, yet within the small chamber at the edge of the city's ruins, a faint flicker of light pulsed steadily against the dark. Nerissa sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor, a fresh sheet of parchment stretched before her, and the poet's verses, inked in hurried, trembling strokes, laid carefully to one side. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and old paper, a haunting reminder of what had been lost in the flames that had devoured the great library. Yet here, in this fragile refuge, the embers of knowledge glimmered anew. Her fingers, still stained with the black ink of her labor, moved with growing confidence and reverence as she traced the poet's words onto the clean page. Each letter was a deliberate act of defiance against oblivion, a testament to the enduring power of the written word. The lines flowed from her brush with a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the city itself, wounded but unyielding. Outside, the night cloaked Alexandria in a veil of mourning. The city's great halls had fallen silent, the voices of scholars stilled by the merciless blaze. But within Nerissa's vigil, there was a quiet rebellion, a promise that the flame of intellect, though battered, would not be extinguished. She paused, eyes lifting to the dim glow of a single oil lamp that cast long shadows across the scattered scrolls and weathered tomes surrounding her. The lamp's flame danced gently, mirroring the fragile hope that sustained her. From the doorway, a figure emerged, slender, worn, yet resolute. The poet himself stood watch, his gaze heavy with the sorrow of loss, but brightened by the ember of hope kindled by Nerissa's dedication. His hands, once unsteady with exhaustion and grief, now steadied as he approached, his voice low and steady. "You carry more than words, Nerissa. You carry our memory." She met his eyes, her own reflecting the weight of that charge. "I will not let it fade. These verses, they are more than ink on parchment. They are the soul of Alexandria, the breath of our people. I will guard them as fiercely as you did." A faint smile touched the poet's lips, a rare light in the shadow of despair. "Then the fire still burns." Days folded into nights as Nerissa continued her vigil, the act of copying becoming a sacred ritual. Each word she transcribed was infused with a silent vow, a bridge between the past and the uncertain future. Outside, the city stirred slowly from its stupor. Survivors moved cautiously amid the ruins, their faces etched with grief and determination. Political factions bickered over the remnants of a shattered legacy, but within this quiet chamber, a new story was being woven, one of resilience and remembrance. One evening, as the first stars pricked the velvet sky, Nerissa stepped outside, clutching a bundle of scrolls pressed close to her chest. The cool night air was crisp, carrying the faint murmurs of a city morning, and yet beginning to hope. She looked toward the horizon, where the faint glow of dawn hinted at renewal. The weight of loss pressed upon her, but so too did the promise of what might yet be preserved. In that moment, she whispered a line from the poet's verses, a soft incantation against darkness. Though all our tongues may burn, the words remain an eternal flame. Her voice, frail yet unwavering, carried through the stillness, a beacon for those who would come after. The vigil was hers now, a solemn duty and a sacred honor. And as the stars wheeled overhead, Nerissa resolved that the fire of knowledge would not die here, not while she held the flame aloft. The poet watched from the shadows, his heart heavy but proud. The legacy he had nurtured in the dying light of the great library was no longer his alone. It had passed into hands steady and sure, hands that would carry the story forward, across the ravages of time and turmoil. As the night deepened, the chamber became a sanctuary of whispered verses and quiet hope. The poet and his apprentice, bound by loss and purpose, faced the uncertain dawn together. The fire had consumed the past, but in their vigilance, the flame of intellect and memory endured, flickering yet unbroken, waiting to blaze anew. And so, in the shadow of destruction amid the ashes of a lost world, Nerissa's vigil began, a testament to the unyielding spirit of human thought. A promise that even in ruin, knowledge would rise again. But the night was not yet over, and the city's fate would still twist through shadows and light. The poet's verses, now entrusted to Nerissa's care, held the fragile hope of a future yet unwritten. What challenges lay ahead, no one could foretell. Yet, in the steadfast hands of the young scribe, the eternal flame of Alexandria's legacy burned on, a quiet defiance against the silence of oblivion. As Nerissa folded a newly completed scroll and set it carefully among the others, a sudden sound startled her, a distant echo of footsteps, or perhaps a whispered voice. She froze, senses sharpened. The city was waking.